Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories of everyday people and their families. I endeavour to continue publishing episodes ad-free. In order to do so, I would love your support by reviewing my podcast or consider becoming a subscriber for only the cost of a coffee a month. This gives you early access to episodes and also access to bonus episodes, of which at this stage there's over 30. Episode 193, George Ettienne Loyau. Marj Howland got in touch with me to tell me about the interesting story of her great-grandfather. She told me that George was a poet, an author and a newspaper editor in many states of Australia in the 19th century, and that her interest in genealogy began because of him. So here is George's story. George Ettienne Loyau was born on the 15th of April 1835 in London, the son of George Ettienne Loyau and his wife Catherine Chanson. His father was born in France and was a professor of languages and died when George was less than a year old. Some family trees have a younger sister, Sarah Louise Loyau, but she was born in 1847, well after George and well after their father's death. She is listed as marrying in Newcastle, New South Wales in 1882, but dying in February 1883 at the age of only 36. Marge has explained that there's a DNA link between Sarah and George, but the DNA link was not strong enough for them to be full siblings, which then began a question mark over George's parentage. George is rumoured to be the son of Henry Thomas Pelham, the 3rd Earl of Chichester, but was swapped at birth. That's from family stories. However, there's no evidence to support this claim. There's also another family theory that George's mother Catherine was actually the sister of Henry Thomas Pelham, the 3rd Earl of Chichester, and her name was Catherine Georgina Pelham, not Catherine Chanson, as his birth records state. The family tree records say that Catherine was born in England in 1805. George went to school at John Eridge's Seminary in Brighton, England from the age of 8. This was a school for gentlemen, and family members believe that it required quite a sum for a child to be educated there, which gives an indicator maybe of having family links with quite a bit of money and social standing. At the age of 15, George was apprenticed to an auctioneer and a surveyor in England and took up clerical work. George sailed to Australia in 1853. He sailed from Gravesend on the Investigator and arrived in Sydney on the 4th of August. His mother financed this voyage, so unsure again how she obtained the funds for her son to do this, possibly linking back again to family links that have a bit of money. For 7 years, George travelled in New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. His occupations were varied, including a gold digger, a shepherd, a hut keeper, a shearer, an overseer, a stockman, a cattle drover, cook, a private tutor and a press correspondent. George began writing verses to be published in newspapers as early as 1854. He became editor of the Burnett Argus at Gander, Queensland in 1861, and then after 4 months transferred to the Maryborough Chronicle, and in 1862 he became a parliamentary reporter and sub-editor on the Queensland Daily Guardian in Brisbane. He published a range of poems in these newspapers. He married Eliza Ann Sharp in Brisbane on the 5th of May 1862. Family trees have Eliza being born in England and emigrating to Brisbane in January 1862. So they married only 4 months after she arrived in Australia. In the Brisbane Courier on the 6th of May 1862, it announces their marriage. On the 6th of May, by licence in the Baptist Church in Brisbane, George Ettienne Loyau, Esquire, late of London, at present reporting for the Guardian newspaper, to Eliza Ann Sharp, 6th daughter of Mr. Henry Sharp, builder of Windsor, Berkshire, England. Interestingly, 2 weeks later in the Maryborough Chronicle, it says, marriage in high life. Not a few of our residents in Gander, we imagine, will be struck with amusement at the following announcement, which is extracted from the Courier, and then goes on to quote the marriage record. So what they're effectively saying is that the George Loyau that they knew didn't seem to be more at Esquire level. In a poem George wrote in October 1862, so only 5 months after his marriage to Eliza, reads, "Without affection and friendship, life is a blank. Burthened by cares, a heavy load, I walk through the world on a cheerless road, and amid my sorrows bow, weary of false and hollow friends, when study alone their private ends. There's few cares for me now. I once had a dear and tender wife, to cheer me mid the cares of life. She pledged the marriage vow, to have me still, mid good or ill. 'Twas a dream, for reality makes me feel there's few care for me now. My friends, alas, now where are they? They are gone too soon, they passed away. To fate's decree I bow. At misfortune's approach they fled my side, and what is a friend till his faith is tried? There's none care for me now. In the silent grave I soon shall rest, no longer lonely and distressed. To God a decree I bow, in heaven above, far from all care. Some angel perhaps will love me there, there's none to love me now. George Loyau, Maryborough, October 1862. So reading through that, it's sounding like he's quite depressed, and it's either been the death of his wife or the separation from his wife, so his wife leaving him, that is expressed in that poem. In 1865, George moved to Sydney, where he stayed for 11 years doing newspaper and clerical work between periods of unemployment. He married Paulina Lynch in Sydney on the 13th of December, 1865. Paulina had been born in 1830 in Hyderabad, East India, and family trees believe that Paulina's mother may have been Indian and her father possibly English. Paulina had married John Lynch in India in 1851 and had 2 daughters with him, and they emigrated to New South Wales in February 1853. A body was found at St Benedict's Church in Sydney in November 1860, believed to be John Lynch, but the information's unconfirmed. What is interesting is that George states himself as a bachelor in his marriage to Paulina, which raises suspicions, in fact, that his first wife was still alive and he quite possibly married bigamously. Or, for some reason, this marriage was annulled. On this marriage certificate, George describes himself as a writing clerk. He also published 3 slim volumes of poetry, The Australian Seasons and The Australian Wildflowers, both published in 1871, and Colonial Lyrics in 1872. In the Town and Country Journal, there was a review of George Loyau's efforts in poetry and prose. In this hard prosaic age, when dress and show are regarded as the chief end of mankind, it is quite refreshing to find a man like the author of The Wildflowers and The Australian Seasons wooing the muse in the midst of poverty and trial. If Mr. Loyau were not a bold and fearless writer, he would not dare to publish poem after poem and story after story amongst a population who have never known much partiality for native talent in letters. Some of his wildflowers are fair to look upon and exhale the grateful odour of the blossoms of poetry. In all he has written, Mr. Loyau is purely Australian. In the city or far away in the bush, he translates what he sees, hears and feels unaffectedly, but with great vigour and expression and graceful ease of language. And on the 5th of July 1873 in the Illustrated Sydney News, there was an article titled Notice of New Book, Colonial Lyrics by George Loyau, published by Beard and Holmes, Sydney. Mr. George Loyau has just published a very readable little volume of original poems under the above title. The number of pages are 48 and the price $1. It has been advanced by more than one author of repute that every man is a poet, more or less, but it's not everyone who appears to have the ability to make his poetical genius appear. Mr. Loyau not only has the poetical conceptive faculty, that he has the power of setting his ideas in very correct verse as a general rule. He appears to be most at home in describing the peculiarities of Australian bush life and scenery. Indeed, we wish that a larger portion of his book had been devoted to poems of this character. Paulina died in 1874 in Sydney, aged only 44. So he became editor of the Gundagai Times, and after 6 months, he moved to Melbourne in 1876, where he worked as a ticket writer and a journalist. In April 1877, he moved to Adelaide, and in the August launched the Australian Family Herald, a weekly magazine of interesting literature, but only 3 issues seem to have appeared. In 1878, he helped found and served as secretary for the Gawler Literary and Dramatic Society, which, despite his best efforts, failed to thrive. By 1879, he married for the 3rd time to Eleanor Ann Parker, known as Annie. He was editor of the Gawler Bunyip in 1878 and 1879, and on the 29th of November 1879 in the Gawler Standard, it mentions a complimentary benefit concert that was given in the Institute Hall for Mr. George Loyau, who for some time has been past editor of the Bunyip and during the week has left Gawler for Adelaide. Mr. Malcolm delivered a speech deserving of the thanks of the entire community for the way in which he had fulfilled the difficult and trying position of editor. He was then editor of the Illustrated Adelaide News in 1880 and 1881. In South Australia, he published the Gawler Handbook in 1880, Representative Men of South Australia, and the Personal Adventures of George Loyau in 1883, and Notable South Australians in 1885. He also edited the South Australian annual Australian Tales by Well-Known Writers in 1877. He put an announcement in to the patrons of the colonial literature in South Australia, George Loyau, and he outlined no short of a dozen or more publications that he'd previously had. And then he announces his intention to publish quarterly a volume of original titles and sketches of life and character in Australia. And at the end of the year, subscriptions can be given where the binding of these four will be put together as an annual 150-page coloured cover publication at 2 shillings per copy. On the 22nd of February 1884 in the Narra Court Herald in South Australia, there's an article titled Loyau's Adventures. We are in receipt of an octavo pamphlet of over 100 pages of letterpress entitled The Personal Adventures of George Loyau, written by himself, and being an account of the author's experiences and remarkable adventures in Australia during the past 30 years. The public are informed in a short preface to the publication that it was intended as a souvenir of last Christmas and New Year, but we're also informed that a second edition is now in publishing, and it's to be presumed that the original idea as to time has been abandoned. The author is evidently of a romantic turn of mind, and he begins his book by telling its readers that he was born in London on the 15th of May 1835, that his father was a French courier who died before he was one. The nationality of the author's mother is not given, but it says she was companion to a lady and resided on the continent, and he was comparatively unknown to his mother until he reached his 8th year. The author adds, there is evidently a mystery surrounding my birth, which up to the present, I regret to say, has never been cleared up. Mr. Loyau is a ready writer, and the work now before us gives evidence that its author is adept in the art of stringing words together. It contains sketches, conversations, and anecdotes illustrative of men and manners in Australia during the gold fever period, and these as a whole are well and truthfully drawn. Colonial slang and the sayings and doings of bushmen and teamsters are correctly rendered and give a very fair idea of the state of society during the 50s and before people settled in the manner seen at the present date. The personal adventures, or as we should call them experiences, extend to the 4 colonies of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Queensland, but the first named was the principal ground upon which the author journeyed, and his pictures are mostly drawn from scenes peculiar to that colony. Altogether, we commend the work as well written, unique and generally correct in those matters of which it professes to treat, but what we should like to see would be a work dealing more with the flora, fauna and material resources of Australia. A traveller of such wide experience in Australia as that possessed by Mr. Loyau could write in a plain and instructive manner upon the natural history of the colonies, based upon his own observations, and would find his publication much more appreciated by intelligent readers than are books containing the lighter matters of men and manners of the lower ranks of Australian people. Mrs. Catherine Loyau, which was spelt Loyan, Loyan, the announcement of her death was in the newspapers, which was in fact in Sydney. On the 25th of April 1884, at her residence in Victoria Street, Darlinghurst, Mrs. Catherine Loyan, Lady of England, aged 79. This does work with the birth dates given on the family trees. It is noted, though, that there's nothing in reference to family members on her death notice. And I've actually been unable to find immigration information for Catherine either, just to fully verify that it is in fact George's mother. By 1895, George was back in Queensland, where he wrote The History of Maryborough in 1897. George's narrative on the personal experiences of himself and the account of his adventures also included descriptions of Aboriginal people, and it was concluded with an appendix of positive reviews from the press for the work. He died of apoplexy at Bundaberg on the 23rd of April 1898 when his youngest child was 11. His death certificate says he was a professor of languages. His obituary, well, William John Sowden wrote one for the Kapunda Herald, and the following was written. The Herald last week recorded the death in Queensland of Mr. George Loyau. Poor old man, what a relief his death must have been to himself. Many years ago he lived in Adelaide as a sort of literary hack, both before and after he edited the Gawler Bunyip, into which he put good writing of the novelette type. Like most poets, he was of a dreamy, unpractical nature, and he was always in trouble as the sparks fly upward. At the last he fell ill, and a few of us pressmen subscribed a purse to him. The next we heard of him, he was editing a little paper in a suburb of Melbourne. He was fond of telling of a mystery which attached to his birth. I think that he fancied that he was related to some noble, if not royal family, and that cruel circumstances kept him out of his rights. On the whole, he was one of the men for whom one always feels sorry. He had not genius enough to elicit admiration, but he was a good plodder, and yet never seemed to get on. All of his plans went awry, with the most provoking persistency, and he constantly was down on his luck. I mentioned just now something not complimentary to his business qualities, and so I ought in fairness to show that he had a notion of the right number of beans required to count 5. One of the books he published in Adelaide was a biography of leading colonists and other men who wanted cheap celebrity. A lot of them have died since, by the way. Among the notables of the time was poor David Bewes, years now gathered into the dead brigade. Loyau wished to have a notice of Bewes and asked him to supply one. This David was too diffident to do, and he said to me, "You know more good about me than anyone else, so just oblige me by writing a bit of a pedigree for Loyau's book." I wrote nearly a page. It was a little volume, but when I took the copy to poor old Loyau, his face bore an expression of doubt. "This is rather long," he remarked. "Why," said I, "here's so-and-so, who is not so nearly as prominent as Bewes, and yet you've given him a page and a half." "Ah," he answered, "that is the case, but Mr. Bewes has only subscribed for 1 copy of the book, and so-and-so has ordered 6. After all, Loyau was not alone in practically applying the theory that a man's biography should depend on the numbers of copies of his biographical work bought by him. Some public men encourage this sort of thing, and not unknown is the circumstance of the man with the longest purse gets the longest notice in personal publications relating to the colonies. I am acquainted with the particulars of cases in which 2 Australian politicians paid very handsomely for a specially complimentary notice in a book. One gave £75 and another £50, but there was at a time a boom in the market for literary puff. And a recollection article on the 1st of May 1948 in the Maryborough Chronicle. The author of the History of Maryborough, Mr. G. E. Loyau, it was stated on good authority that George Ettienne Loyau was a member of the Earl of Chichester's family. At the age of 17 he came to Sydney, where on arrival, finding he could not get employment, commenced his wanderings with some shipmates. Bohemian fashion throughout the length and breadth of Australia, he toiled long in the cause of Australian literature, having been for 40 years connected with the colonial press as editor, leader writer, general contributor, poet, essayist and author of fiction. And another little snippet in the Nambucca and Bellinger News on the 6th of March 1931, when they were recollecting past newspapers, it says, "The most picturesque figure was George Loyau, the most shabbily dressed man of a mob, which was far from spruce, heaven knows. He was also a nephew of the Earl of Chichester. He lived by issuing men of mark, representative South Australians and so on. His modus operandi was to tap the men whom he was going to honour for as much as he could get. At the finish he would bring out a skimpy, dingy, ill-printed volume on the cheapest paper and illustrated by villainous woodcuts of some of his victims. Some of these would only part once, others were milking cows. Among the latter was good bluff old Sir Thomas Elder. At last, when Loyau called with yet another book in view, Sir Thomas lost patience and said, 'Look here, Loyau, here's a couple of pounds, but by Jove, if you repeat that caricature of me that appeared last time, I'll flog you first and put you in jail for libel afterwards.'" And on the 23rd of June 1898 in the Adelaide Advertiser, the late Mr. George Loyau. To the editor. "Sir, on behalf and at the special request of the widow and her 4 children of the above well-known journalist and author, who died about April 27th last in Bundaberg, allow me to make an appeal to friends in South Australia for financial assistance to relieve them from the pangs of absolute poverty. About 3 years ago, Mr. Loyau was struck down with a paralytic stroke and then suffered greatly and was also invalidated. This and the financial failure of his latest book, The History of Maryborough, which he wrote and published shortly before his death, accounts for the sad poverty with which his family have found themselves afflicted. I write to your colony because this journalist has been long favourably known in South Australia. From some of Mr. Loyau's private notes, it appears he'd been editor of the Illustrated Adelaide News, Freeman's Weekly, Bunyip at Gawler and Norwood Times, and editor and proprietor of the Australian Family Herald, contributor to the Advertiser, Observer and Australian Star. He was the author of the Gawler Handbook, Representative Men of South Australia, Personal Adventures, The Lifer, Australian Press Experiences, Leichhardt, The Lost Explorer, and many other works too numerous to mention, published in a book form in Adelaide. It is to be hoped South Australians will deem the family of this busy Australian writer worthy of some assistance now that their unfortunate breadwinner has departed. Trusting that, Mr. Editor, you will kindly undertake to receive subscriptions and that some other leading South Australian papers may copy this letter and follow your example. C. A. Hoff. P.S. Mrs. Loyau's residence is GPO Brisbane. She and her family at present living in a small cottage without furniture of any kind, absolutely unsettled. Money is very tight in Brisbane and I've only received 10 shillings so far locally for her assistance. And the editor added a note that we will kindly take charge of subscriptions sent to us. Loyau claimed to have contributed many poems, novels, short stories and other articles to many newspapers, and despite this work he lived in poverty for much of his life. Occasionally he complained about the lack of public appreciation of literature. Few of his poems have outlived 19th century taste. He was capable of a great variety in prose style, flowery journalism and tedious descriptions, right through to straightforward narrative and lively whimsical anecdotes. His Gawler Handbook and History of Maryborough are valuable sources for local history, although the latter suffers from its hasty compilation. His best and most consistent work is the 2 volumes of short biographies of his South Australian contemporaries. Publications that have been released on George Loyau. In 1991, Hugh Anderson had a songbook titled George Loyau, the Man Who Wrote Bush Ballads, and it incorporates lyrics and melody. And in 1888, Henry Stuart Russell wrote a publication titled The Genesis of Queensland, The History of Maryborough and Wide Bay Burnett Districts from 1850 to 1895, compiled with authentic sources by George E. Loyau. And this is available at the State Library of Queensland, Brisbane, in a digital form. George Loyau's children. He had no children with his first marriage, as it was quite short-lived as well, but with his second marriage with Paulina, he had Louise Lydia Loyau, who was born in 1867 in Strawberry Hills, New South Wales. On the 26th of May 1875, she was admitted into the Randwick Institute for Destitute Children, and it said that she was received from the sister, and this was probably Paulina Lynch, the half-sister and daughter of their deceased mother, Paulina. In March 1880, she was apprenticed to the Randwick Institute for Destitute Children at 12 years and 10 months. On the 26th of December 1912, Louisa married James Thomas Lye in Chatswood, New South Wales, and Louise died on the 11th of July 1941 in Chatswood at the age of 74. Her husband had died nearly exactly 12 months before her. The second child that George had with Paulina was George Ettienne Loyau Jr. He was born on the 25th of January 1868 at Haymarket, New South Wales. He was also admitted to the Randwick Institute for Destitute Children at the same time as his sister, and he was apprenticed to Mr. Joseph Julian in Windsor at the age of 13. He married Colleen Taylor in Coaldale, New South Wales in 1897. In 1943, he is listed in the census at living at Coaldale, but Colleen's not listed. He died on the 1st of July 1948 at the State Hospital and Home at Liverpool, and it's stated that he was late of Garley Street, Coaldale. He was aged 80. And just an interesting note, when he married Colleen Taylor in Coaldale in 1897, he did state that his father was George Loyau and he was a journalist, so he was aware of his father and what he did. However, his mother is listed as not known. The third child was Edgar Julius Loyau, and he was born on the 5th of December 1869 in Sydney. The death occurred of him on the 23rd of December 1869 at the same address in Elizabeth Street, Sydney, so he only lived a few weeks. And with his third marriage to Eleanor Parker, there was a birth of a daughter, and this was in the paper on the 30th of September 1876 in the Fitzroy Mercury. It says Loyau at her residence, Gore Street, Fitzroy, on the 24th of September, wife of Mr. G.E. Loyau, a daughter. And this daughter was Annie Alice Ettienne Loyau. She married Hugh Riley in Queensland in August 1911 when Annie was 34 and Hugh 24. And he died on the 14th of September 1919 in Mitchell, Queensland, aged only 42. Lily Eleanor Loyau. She was born on the 6th of July 1879 at Churchill in South Australia, and she was a twin. And the announcement says, Loyau, at her residence at Churchill on Sunday morning, the 6th of July, the wife of George Loyau, of twin daughters, all doing well. Unfortunately, however, Lily did not survive. She died on the 18th of December 1879, and the death notice reads, Loyau, at Adelaide, Lily Eleanor, the infant daughter of George E. and Annie E. Loyau, aged 5 months, one of the twins. So the other twin was Rose Juliet Loyau, and she married Haviland Leslie Yates in Stroud, New South Wales in 1906 when Rose was 27 and Haviland 24. They had 7 children, and they farmed in central Lansdowne in New South Wales and retired to Taree in New South Wales. Rose died at Hamilton, New South Wales, aged 84. Another child, Edgar August Loyau, was born on the 6th of August 1881 in Adelaide. And in 1930, there was a small article titled Case of Mr. E. A. Loyau. Mr. E. A. Loyau was examined on Monday afternoon by the government medical officer and admitted to hospital prior to the meeting arranged by the Australian Society of Patriots to protest against the refusal of the government to grant him an invalid pension, and he is now receiving attention in the General Hospital. The Australian Society has constantly supported the claims of Mr. Loyau during the past year. And he died on the 13th of March 1940 in Lismore, New South Wales. His death was announced in the Northern Star of Lismore. Mr. Edgar Loyau, 59, a pensioner of Lismore, died at the Lismore Base Hospital after an illness of several months. He was a single man and is survived by his sister, Mrs. H. Yates of Taree. The next child was Eleanor Angus Loyau, born on the 21st of May 1883 in Adelaide, and she died on the 7th of June 1886. The death notice states, Loyau at Gawler South of congestion of the brain, Eleanor Angus Loyau, the dearly beloved child of Eleanor A. and George E. Loyau, aged 3 years and 1 month, perfect in form, angelic in disposition, noble in nature. Sounds quite likely her father would have penned that. The next child was Gertrude Isa Blanche Loyau, who was born on the 30th of April 1887 in Adelaide. She married William Brown in Gloucester, New South Wales in April 1907. They had 6 children. William was a carpenter and they were living at Wallsend in New South Wales in 1917. And Gertrude died at Lismore in 1932, aged only 45. So a very interesting man in terms of the early colonies, where he tried so hard to ensure that his creativity was shared and publicised for the Australian public to mixed results. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.